comes to Native Americans, our country has a long-standing tradition. Now, you might think it's Thanksgiving, but it's not. It's erasure. Don't know what I mean? Well, let me explain in a segment called How Did We Get Here? November is National Native American Heritage Month, a time to celebrate the rich culture of the first people of this land. But sadly, since the founding of our country, the U.S. government has been working harder than a toddler with an Etch-a-Sketch to try to erase it. And like Gargamel trying to catch a Smurf, they have cooked up about 1 million evil schemes to do it. But we never learned this stuff in school. So before we get inundated with Happy Thanksgiving imagery this month, let's talk about it. And to start, let's visit the 1860s. But not really, because I don't want to wear 17 skirts at once. In the 1860s, the U.S. government took Native kids from their families and placed them in boarding schools. And not one of those fun boarding schools where you get good advice from Mrs. Garrett. These boarding schools were created for the sole purpose of making Native kids whiter, or as the government described it, to help Native kids assimilate, which is insane. They didn't need to assimilate to America because they were here first. That's like a burglar breaking into your house and sending you off to burglar school to make you more burglary. The U.S. government sent tens of thousands of Native children to these boarding schools with the express purpose of making them less Native. The schools were incredibly abusive, and thousands of kids died in them and were then buried in unmarked graves, some of which are still being discovered today. The schools were also an effort at land acquisition. Now, stay with me. While Native kids were in boarding schools, they were discouraged from continuing their agricultural practices. So Native people started relying more on goods they purchased from the government on credit. And when these folks fell into debt, they gave up their land as payment. It's a horrible part of our nation's history, and you can learn more about it in the director's cut of A Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. Now, let's visit the World War II era, but not really, because I don't want to wear a bathing suit with a belt. Now, what is it holding up? Despite everything the U.S. had done to Native people, they were actually the first to step up and fight on the nation's behalf in World War II. In some tribes, as many as 70% of eligible men served, which is amazing because usually when you hear a sentence start with 70% of men, it ends with, think they could beat Serena Williams at tennis. But after those men bravely served, they came back to find the reservations they lived on had been devastated. And here's the worst part. That was part of the plan. See, the government wanted to get Native Americans off the reservations, first because they were still into the assimilation thing, and second, so that they could steal the land. These people are worse than Gargamel. This is some Skeletor level shit. The government passed something called the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, which, among other things, dissolved federal funding for reservations, schools, hospitals, and basic services. It's truly insane. It's like when your landlord refuses to fix your bathtub to force you to move out, except your landlord is the U.S. government and the bathtub is everything you need to stay alive. And just when you think it can't get worse, it does, which, by the way, is the official slogan of American history. Because around the same time, the U.S. government created something called a termination policy. That's where they gave up the game entirely. They didn't just stop paying for stuff. They said, hey, tribes, you're not tribes anymore. Literally. Between 1953 and 1964, 109 tribes were terminated. That means that 2.5 million acres of trust land was removed from protected status, and 12,000 Native Americans lost tribal affiliation. Honestly, it's hard to talk about. It's one of those things that you wish you never found out, like the fact that Buzz Aldrin peed his pants on the moon. That is true, he admits it, and I can't unknow it. And that was the very last time the U.S. tried to erase Native culture. Just kidding. As we said before, just when you think it can't get worse, it does. So let's visit 2022, but not really, because I don't want to wear boyfriend jeans. Have you ever had a boyfriend? They don't do laundry. Why would I want to wear his dirty-ass jeans? This week, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Holland versus Brackeen, a case about a white couple who are challenging a current U.S. law called called the Indian Child Welfare Act. That law says that in order to preserve Native culture, we should place Native children who are up for adoption with Native parents whenever possible. And let me tell you, we need this law because in the 60s and 70s, 25 to 35% of all Native children had been separated from their families and put into foster care or adopted. And 90% were placed in non-Indian homes. Now, this law was put into place to stop that. Well, the white couple in Holland versus Brackeen is basically saying that that law is reverse racism. But if reverse racism were a thing, then they wouldn't lock up black hair care products at Walgreens, they'd lock up sunscreen. And Skinny Girl margaritas. But also, this case is actually about a lot more than that. Saying this case is about adoption is like saying When Harry Met Sally is about orgasms. But that's part of it, but it's not the whole picture. Okay, so, see, it turns out the lawyers representing the couple in this case also represent fossil fuel companies. Now, why would fossil fuel companies care about an adoption case? Because, and stay with me again, if you take away the government's right to make special rules for the tribes, you could undermine tribal sovereignty altogether. And that means that all those reservation lands would be up for grabs. And just like a person who ate at Taco Bell, that land is full of oil and gas. So those companies will support anything that could possibly get them that land. So now we've left Skeletor level and entered Mr. Burns level territory. These oil companies are trying to do what our government has been trying to do since its founding: erase Native people for their own personal benefit. And this month, the Supreme Court will decide if they're going to let them do that. So this November, let's celebrate Native history and culture. And while we're doing that, let's also be honest about our country's long history of trying to erase it. And let's commit to stopping that cycle. And while we're at it, let's also commit to getting rid of boyfriend jeans. This has been How Did We Get Here?